Become a member on Patreon to watch the ad-free video version of this interview. The link is in the description.
Beyond the Forbidden.
Welcome to Beyond the Forbidden. Today on the show, I got Kevin Randle. We tried to get this thing started maybe about a month ago. We just had some bad luck with internet connection or whatever it is, but I think it was on my end. I think I got it fixed. I did get fiber now, AT&T fiber, so it's supposed to be pretty good. We'll see how it goes. But Kevin Randle, welcome back.
Well, I'm glad to be here.
So we were talking a little bit before show and talking about military days and with your service and a little bit about mine. I had I've been podcasting since 2010. I've had a couple different names of the podcast, but I think it was 2010. I had JC Marcel Jr. And if I remember correctly, what year did he die? JC Marcel Jr. Was it 13, 14 or something like that?
I was going to say 13. It was not long after the big thing in Washington, D.C. that Steve Bassett had organized.
Yeah.
And he was there, and he didn't look really good at that point. And I think it was shortly after 2013 that he passed.
Yeah. And I know when I talked to him, and I think it was 2010, I think he was still in the military, wasn't he? Like, wasn't he like a doctor or something?
He was a doctor. He got recalled to the into the Army. He was like 67 years old.
Yeah,
but he was a doctor, so critical
and I
MOS,
think
I should say. And so he went to Iraq for about a year. And the one thing that's kind of funny, he asked me at one point, should he take his own computer to Iraq? And I said, the best thing I ever did was buy a new computer laptop just before I went to Iraq. So yeah, take your own computer. I ended up as an intelligence officer, I was issued a computer too. So I'm standing in the line to get on the airplane. Well, you wouldn't know because you didn't deploy.
Yeah.
But we all had to get weighed with all our equipment. I weighed like 350 pounds because of the equipment. I had my weapon, and I'm standing there with two computers. I'm going to war, and I've got two laptop computers, all this other ancillary stuff.
Man, I was just wondering because I thought, I haven't listened to that interview in a while. Man, what was that? 14 years ago. Yeah. And I thought he said he was getting ready to deploy again. And I was,
he only went once. Now he'd been in Southeast Asia at one point.
Or maybe he said he may get caught up again. I remember talking to him, or I don't remember what it was. I was just wondering, did he go again? Because I know he went once, but I wasn't sure, did he go again, though?
No, he only went one time.
Okay.
But he suffered badly from PTSD once he got back.
Yeah.
The slightest noise would make him jump. So I have to hear a louder noise to jump, but he would.
Yeah. Man,
pretty stressed out by that.
I could tell, when I did interview him that and it's going to be, kind of segue into, your work in Roswell and the UFO situation, disclosure and all that. But I did, because I've listened to, I started really diving into research when I kind of got back from basic training in 06 of, documentaries, reading and all that stuff. But I remember listening to a bunch of interviews, like either on Art Bell, Coast to Coast, and he just sounded different compared to, I don't know if it was the PTSD or if he just knew his time was kind of coming up or whatever. I don't even know how he died, but yeah,
he was sitting in a chair reading a UFO book.
Wow, man.
I like to think it was not one of mine.
No, man. So anyways, you've been researching for a long time. How long does it go back? Like, what's first sparked your interest in UFOs, the paranormal, Roswell. How far back are we going? 'Cause I know you said you went in the military at, what was it, 71,
No, I went in the military at 67.
67. So was it before that? Was your interest before that?
Yes,
Or
yes.
okay. Take us back on memory lane a little bit, Kevin.
Give me a chance here, guy. Keep asking the question. Uh, what sparked my interest was the movie Earth versus the Flying Saucers. My mother took me to that movie. I think it came out in 1956. And that kind of sparked my interest. And then we got into the point where we had the big wave of sightings in 1964 with Lonnie Zamora, which was national news. And we moved into the end of the Blue Book era with the Condon Committee. I lived in Colorado at the time, so a friend of mine who was also interested in UFOs, we were very excited about the UFO project coming to Colorado, which didn't work out all that well for the rest of us. But while I was at Fort Rucker, actually at Fort Walters, as a matter of fact, there was a guy named Carol Wayne Watts who said that he had been taken on board. I didn't want to say abducted, taken on board a flying saucer. He was invited on board and told his story. And then he was going to go take a lie detector test. And he claimed that he was waylaid on the way and people threatened him. So he didn't go take the test. But he lived in up near, I always want to say Armadillo, but it's really Amarillo, Texas. And I was at Fort Walters in flight school. And we could get a 3-day pass, weekend pass, starting on Friday night, coming back on Sunday evening. If we had family or friends coming to visit, one-time good deal. So I put in the paperwork to take a 3-day pass and went to interview Carol Wayne Watts. So the point simply is, by the way, the Watts story was a hoax. It really was. But I still have the tape of the interview. But while I was at Fort Walters and later Fort Rucker, friends and I went to investigate UFO sightings in that area. I think we were in was Weeki Wachee, Florida. A guy named Reeves, who claimed he had seen a landed craft and a robot and all this stuff. And we went and interviewed people about that, and we went and visited some other people. So while I was in the service, when I had an opportunity, no matter where we were, if I could get to a newspaper and look at the morgue, I'd look at all the UFO stories and see what they had to say and take advantage of being there to do that. And then once I came back from Vietnam, and we were pretty much on a, well, it really wasn't 9 to 5. It was more like 7 to 7, but we had time off and we had weekends off and things like that. I would do UFO research. Went to Aurora, Texas, I think before everybody else went there, to talk to the people in Aurora, Texas, and did other investigations around that. I was a member of the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, Corolla Engines Group, out of Tucson, and I went over and visited Herb at one point about that. So the interest goes back to the mid 1950s. And whenever I had an opportunity to do any additional research, I would take that opportunity and do that. Got involved in Roswell. I was, as a science fiction writer, I would go to science fiction conventions because the editors of the magazines and the books go to the conventions too, and we would get to meet them. And Bob Cornett and I thought it would be a good idea to meet them. So when we submit, they would at least know who we were, and it might give us a leg up. Well, one of the conventions, they were going to have a debate between science fiction writers and some guys from CUFOS coming up to in Madison, Wisconsin. And when it came time to do the debate, there was only one guy from CUFOS. The other two didn't show up, and I'm on the panel with 3 science fiction writers. And I said, well, I'll just switch sides, because if you're in a debate, you're supposed to be able to take whatever position. Now, one of the guys on the panel I know for sure was Frederick Pohl, and if you're a science fiction fan, you know who he was. I think one of the guys was also George R.R. Martin before he became George R.R. Martin and the Game of Thrones guy.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd met him a couple of times. He used to live, I think, in Dubuque, Iowa. But Don Schmidt was the guy that came up from CUFOS, and we got to talking. And not long after that convention, I got a call from him. And he was talking,
What year was that, Kevin? Roughly?
would have been 1988. I'm going to say 1888. It was a long time ago and very far away. Anyways, 1988, and I got a call from him not long after that. He said Kufos was reopening the Roswell investigation. They had been in communication with Stan Friedman, and Friedman told me, yeah, there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of witnesses to be interviewed, and he was busy chasing MJ-12. So because Don knew that I had a military background, and a lot of the witnesses we would be talking to had military backgrounds, he thought I'd be able to relate to them better. And if nothing else, I could understand the jargon. And I don't know if you have, but I've sat in meetings with the military where the acronyms and the jargon is flying so fast, it's hard to keep up. And it's like it's foreign language. I don't know what the hell you people are talking about here. Put it in English. Anyway, so Don wanted to know if I would be interested in joining their investigation in Roswell. And I said, sure. Because I just published, but I'd done a lot of magazine articles in the 70s. There were like 6 magazines, commercial magazines about UFOs.
Which magazines are those? If I can cut you off, because I'm a collector of older magazines. What magazines mostly are those?
UFO Report, Truths, Flying Saucers, and UFOs, Argosy UFO.
What about the Searcher?
UFO.
What about the Searcher?
No, these were commercial magazines.
Oh, okay.
Published in New York. They were paying actual cash money. I paid my way through college writing magazine articles about UFOs.
Wow. You couldn't beat that, huh?
No. I like to say I went to I got the Saga scholarship. Saga magazine had the UFO report, and the pay for an article was $10 short of my tuition. So every semester I would manage to sell them an article, and that would pay my tuition for the semester. So I did a lot of that. And then it got to a point, Bob Cornett, whom I mentioned earlier, we actually went down when the Project Blue Book files were released to Maxwell Air Force Base. There was a flyer that came around to the ROTC detachments, and it said in there that the Project Blue Books were now in Maxwell Air Force Base, and you could come and look at them if you wanted to, that kind of thing. I called Saga Magazine, and I told them, I would call them periodically, and the editor would maybe call me back, maybe he wouldn't. It'd be days later he'd call me back. So I called Saga Magazine and asked for the editor. They said, well, he's not available right now. Can I take a message? And I said, yeah, tell him I get the Project Blue Book files. 5 minutes later, he's called me back. And he's saying, now, when you get in there, do this, that, and the other thing. And I said, I take it I have an assignment. And he said, yes. So Bob Cornett and I went down to Maxwell Air Force Base. When we looked at the Project Blue Book files, they had not been redacted. So the first thing we did, we got a hold of the index. The first thing we did was go through the entire index and write down the names of all the people who were involved with unidentified sightings. We'd have the date, we'd have the location, and the name of the witness. If you go to the index, as it was released publicly, the names are all redacted. Now, I have found, I think, one case where I could not find the name of the witness in the file that they missed when they were redacting it, but the index, it was all redacted out. So we went down there and did that, but we were also, Bob and I wanted to write science fiction. So we ended up writing a science fiction novel, and I had for writing magazine articles kind of evaporated because they published them all, and I hadn't written anything while we were writing science fiction. So I did a book called UFO Report, which was my magazine articles collected into a single volume. And that came out in 1989, which is one of the things I did in 1988 when Don Schmidt was in, when we were at that convention. I interviewed him. So I had some interviews with people who were more current in the UFO field. So it was not only the magazine articles, but was other stuff. And I actually had an interview with Bill Brazel, actually with Shirley Brazel, because Bill was out in the barn. We did eventually meet Bill Brazel, but that kind of started the Roswell case. And we went down there thinking, it's nothing to it. We'll find the solution and we'll come home. We were scheduled to interview Frank Joyce, who was a radio announcer reporter for KGFL in Roswell, and is responsible for one of the press releases that you read about in the newspapers. And we got down to Albuquerque, and we called him to set up the time, and he said, well, he wasn't feeling well, could we postpone? So that was a disappointment. We had a meeting with a bunch of people that had a UFO group who really didn't have a UFO group. It was more of a new age woo-woo group, which was absolutely useless to us. We went down to Roswell to meet Clifford Stone, who didn't want us to come to his house to meet him. We wanted to meet us at the Burger King on Main Street, North Main Street. And he walks in his military uniform, and I said to Don, "Oh, this is going to be fun." And the weird thing, it eventually took us to his house. I don't know why we couldn't go to the house in the first place. And it was listed in the Roswell phone book. So it wasn't like he was hiding his address from us. We could have found it. So we went and we were talking to him. And at one point he said, "I got to go outside." And he comes back in the house and he's carrying a folder that says, got one of the top secret cover sheets on it. I'm sure you saw those in your work in the military. He had one of those on it. And he went into his bedroom, and I said to Don at that point, unless he's got a vault in there, he's going to jail. Because top secret requires a vault, not a safe, a vault.
Well, you're not supposed to have it at your home, though, right?
Well, that's true too. But I mean, just the fact that he did that to impress us, and I'm going, yeah, right. I've got the cover sheets too, if you'd like to see them. In fact, we used Bob and I wrote a science fiction novel called, well, they changed the name to Seeds of War, and we had a mock-up of the classified information cover sheet in there. So it's like as you read the novel, it was all classified information you were getting. It's a kind of a nice trick, I suppose. But that was very disappointing. And I thought, well, he's not telling us anything he didn't know. At one point he said to us, "Well, you know, there's this Peruvian Air Force pilot was chasing a UFO, and he shot at it, and the bullets bounced off." And he says, "And here's the telex or the message traffic on it." I read that over, and what it said was he fired on it without results. Well, that might mean he missed. Didn't say anything about him hitting it, just said it fired on it without results. So I thought, well, that was absolutely worthless. But the last interview we had was with Bill Brazel, the son of the man that found the stuff, turned the whole thing around. And I said, as we were going back to Albuquerque to catch the plane, I said, "Don, we got to come back." We didn't find an answer, and Bill Brazel just changed the whole direction of the investigation with what he told us. And so we went back many, many times, and that side of got us involved with the Roswell case. But at the same time, you know, I had a lot of information from the Project Blue Book files that we had collected. Bob Connett and I had collected, and other things like that. So my interest wasn't limited to Roswell. It was just that took more of the time. And the second book I did on UFOs, I think, was a UFO crash at Roswell. And then
you did the UFO case book. Well, that was 89.
Yeah, that came out in 89, and it did really well. And so I proposed a second book, and they said no. And I'm thinking, it not only earned out its advance, it went into multiple printings, and you guys don't want it. What's wrong with you? But then I did the with Don Schmidt, I did the UFO called History of UFO Crashes. And my agent called and said, called Conspiracy of Silence about UFOs. And I'm thinking, yeah, of course I can. You got a contract for me to write a book. I'm going to do that. And so it exploded out of there. I did lots of books. I think the count of UFO books is like 37. Brad Steiger and I used to argue about who'd written the most UFO books. I thought it was him. He thought it was me. Turns out it really was me. I think, well, Nick Redford was giving me a run for the money, but I think he's kind of diverted into other kinds of things too. And I just had a book published in Russia, for God's sakes. The only words I can read in it was my name.
Which ones were those?
Well, oh, good Lord. I think the Russian book was Project Blue Book. I've got three books coming in the next year. And I've had other books. Czech Republic has published books. Germany's republished books. I did a series called Vietnam Ground Zero, which an English publisher called me and wanted to reprint those. And so those have just come out again, and they're doing really well. And I mention that because I had books done in the Vietnam Ground Zero books done in the Philippines, And in Japanese, I have a copy of the Japanese book, of which I, of course, can't read anything in either. So I've had a lot of books published around there. So been very fortunate in the writing career, both in the science fiction, action adventure, and the UFO stuff.
So you glitched out just for just a few seconds, during the last few minutes. If we lose signal, just log back in, because and we'll just continue with that, and I'll just edit everything together, splice it. But so with all your research, into Roswell, just on Roswell, and you wrote many books. What do you think? How has your research evolved over the years? Like compared from your younger days into the research to the phenomena up into present day. Do you feel like you're a little closer to what happened, what took place in Roswell over the years from then up into present day, Kevin?
Well, following the first part of the question, how has my research evolved? When I to Roswell, I was of the false notion that as you're talking to people, former military people, they're not going to be lying to you. Turned out an awful lot of them did. And so we became very carefully vetting people. And the best example of this is actually doesn't reflect Roswell, but another crash, the Del Rio crash from 1948, 1950, 1954, 1955. That would work. But there was a guy named Robert Willingham and claimed to be a retired Air Force colonel. And he signed an affidavit about the events at Del Rio. And when I did History of UFO Crashes, I believed the story and had the copy of the affidavit in there as well. And as I was doing a new book called Crash When UFOs Fall from the Sky, I thought, now that we have access to the internet, I thought I'd see if there was anything new on that, and learned that Noah Torres and Ruben Uriarte had done a book called The Other Roswell, and it was based on Willingham's testimony. And I got to reading that book and looked at the original information, and had evolved. That information had evolved, and it turned out nobody had ever vetted this guy. They just accepted what he'd said. They had pictures of him in Air Force uniforms in the 1960s and thought, well, yeah, the guy's telling the truth. Turned out the uniforms were Civil Air Patrol, which is close, but no cigar. And so I got his military records, and it said he had been in the military. He had been in the Army, not in the Air Force, months. And he said, well, he was a World War II veteran. He joined the Army in December of 1945. All the shooting was done in September of 1945, but the war wasn't declared officially over until the middle of 1946. So people who joined after the shooting stopped got credit for being World War II veterans. And the Vietnam era was, you were either in Vietnam or you were a Vietnam era veteran. There was a distinction. In World War II, there was no such a distinction. But he was there he was in the Army for 13 months, rose to the rank of E4. You'll understand that's a very low-ranking enlisted guy. He was running around claiming to be a colonel. And one guy said, well, how come there be pictures of him from the 1960s if he's just making this stuff up? And I said, Noe Torres sent me the pictures of him in his Air Force uniform. And I looked at the first one and I said, this isn't Air Force, this is Civil Air Patrol. And you could tell because Civil Air Patrol rolled a metal plate above the pocket that said, Civil Air Patrol Official Auxiliary of the United States Air Force. And Civil Air Patrol, for those that don't know, it's a civilian organization. They do a lot of search and rescue. They have a cadet program. But in the United States, a lot of the search and rescue type missions, when an airplane disappears, the search and rescue part is from the Civil Air Patrol doing it. They don't get paid for it, but they get reimbursed for their expenses. So you own a private plane and you want some flying time. Well, here's how to get it paid for. And the other pictures that they showed me, he had a mixture of his Civil Air Patrol ribbons and his and Army ribbons, none of which he had earned, by the way, on the uniform. And I said, well, in the Civil Air Patrol, you can wear your military awards on your uniform, but if you're in the Air Force, you cannot wear Civil Air Patrol ribbons. So there were a lot of clues. The point simply being is people weren't vetting these people. They would take them at their word, or the people would share some documentation, and you'd find out the documentation is forged. We ran into a bunch of that in the Roswell case. But in the beginning, I was more likely to accept the testimony of somebody without bothering to vet it. And then I got to the point where if somebody told me, well, they'd been in the military, I started getting the records from the unclassified, or the records didn't fall under the Privacy Act, from St. Louis, where the big military repository is, and learned that these people were just making stuff up. Frank Kaufman springs to mind. We believe Frank Kaufman. He showed us his separation papers from World War II and showed his training as a intelligence NCO and all of this stuff. When it became clear he was not telling the truth, we got his records. We didn't accept what he gave us. We got his records. It turned out he hadn't been a master sergeant, as he claimed. He'd been a staff sergeant, and he was trained in administration. There's no indication he had any intelligence training whatsoever. So we became very skeptical of what people told us and began trying to chase everything down that we could to find out whether they're telling the truth, some of the truth, or none of the truth. We had to be very careful on that. One of the things I did originally is Walter Hott at Roswell in 1947 created a yearbook type thing. It was everybody on the base. I think he started the work in like May of 1947. They submitted the stuff to the publisher in August, and then they got the book back in November. This book with nearly everybody at the base listed in it. So I sent a note to Walter Hott and said, "Could you make me a copy of that book? And here's money to pay the cost of copying. If there's anything left over, buy yourself a nice bottle of booze." So he did that. So if you came to me and said, "Well, I was in Roswell in 1947," and I'd say, "What's your name?" And then we'd look you up. And if you don't show up in the yearbook, we'd say, "Well, that's kind of weird." We also had a copy of the directory from the base phone directory. And so we could find people in there. A woman said that her uncle named Rasmussen had been in Roswell in 1947 and talked to her father about the craft and the bodies. And so we go to the yearbook and he's not there. Looked in the phone book, there he is, bigger than life. So it wasn't, well, if you weren't there, you must be lying. We had other sources that we could trace down. And if we didn't find any reference to you at the base, and they would say, "Well, do you have any documentation?" And I know, and you probably do as well. One of the things I told you in basic training, there are certain dockets you must hold on to because they'll become valuable later.
Mm-hmm.
One of them, like the DD Form 214, and where I live, if you're a veteran, you can get your property tax reduced by a certain amount if you're a veteran, but you have to take a DD Form 214 in. So I've got documents going back to the 1960s from my military service. So if you challenge me on points, for example, in Vietnam, I'm probably the only pilot you know who ever blew up a helicopter on a landmine. I hit a landmine with a helicopter. But if you go to the 187th Assault Helicopter Company, 187th AHC, and you go to, I think it's May 16th, 1969, you'll find a note in there that says I blew up a helicopter on a landmine. So it's not a website I control. It's a website controlled by former members of the 187th Assault Helicopter Company, but it documents what I say about blowing up the helicopter. That's in the unit history. And that's the other point. There are, if we can't find a guy in certain things, we can look other things up on the internet. And if he has no documentation, the excuses for not having the documentation is just preposterous. So that's a very long-winded answer to say my investigative skills changed from the beginning, and I became much more skeptical of stuff and learned how to research other aspects of that and find additional information. One of the things that just happened, Robert Powell did a book about UFOs. It's more of a primer for somebody that hasn't got a lot of experience with UFOs. And there was a case in the book from March 29th, 1952, and it talked about electromagnetic effects. These are shutting down the car engines and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very interested in those cases. And this was a Project Blue Book case, but he didn't have the names because the names were redacted from the index. But I've got an unredacted copy of the index. So I looked up the names and I wrote him a note and said, well, I found these names, and we got to talking about it. And we're doing some additional research, and it turned out that the Air Force file is absolutely incorrect. It's horrible. The case didn't take, originally said it took place on April 19th. Then it was on March, I think, 29th, 1952. And they called it a hoax. Well, if you go through the documentation, and Barry Greenwood was very helpful in sending us some clippings from that time. I confirmed the names of the guys from the index, but there was another two people who'd seen it, and there was a newspaper article, and the article's dated, I think, March 15th, and the sighting took place on March 14th. In the Air Force file, they're talking to all these people who were around on March 29th, and they're all saying no, and they're writing off as hope. They got the date wrong. You know, all they needed to do is look at the newspaper, and they'd realize they got the date wrong. And so, learn to verify all that information as best we can in today's environment. I know that's a very long-winded answer, and I probably should be quiet now.
No, this
For a while
show,
anyway.
this show is, about you and your, with your research from the past up into modern day, and I'm always here, I like to try not to interrupt as much as a lot of other hosts do to their guests. But
Well, I know when I've got my own show that I record on Wednesday afternoons, and you can link to it on my blog. You can see all the shows I've done. But sometimes I do interrupt the guests because I want a question answered. I want things done.
Yeah.
Or I have to go to actual commercial breaks.
So you said something about people, researchers in the field, not vetting people, not doing proper vetting. Do you think that from back in the day, from the early days of the research into the UFO phenomena, Roswell and everything, and other cases, with the lack of vetting the sources and things like that, of that nature, do you think over time, over the decades, it just has gotten messier and messier and messier to where it's so hard to decipher and to swift out what's the actual truth from actual false cases and those who are just plain out lying, to where it's just a big giant soup sandwich, as they would say in the military, today compared to back then, because over the decades, things have just gotten messier and messier because of improper vetting.
Well, we can look at some of the cases. I do something on my blog called Chasing Footnotes, and it just is usually something I've come across. I'm doing some research on something, and I found a case I'm interested in, and there's a footnote. So I go to that source, to the next source, to the next source. And one of the examples is I was trying to find cases where people talked about flying discs, flying saucers prior to Kenneth Arnold, because the idea was Arnold had said, described the craft as crescent shaped, but the term flying saucer grew out of his description of how they moved across the sky, like a saucer skipping across a pond. That was kind of the motion, and it became flying saucers. So the skeptical idea was, well, this put the idea of saucer-shaped craft in the minds of people, and so they're describing something that really wasn't true. And I was looking for cases that predated Arnold by a few weeks that I could verify in some fashion, where it talked about a saucer-shaped craft or disc-shaped craft. And Frank Edwards had talked about a sighting in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, where a railroad engineer, meaning the guy driving the train as opposed to the guy who was designing the railroads, a group of flying saucers on the day before Arnold's sighting, and it was in the newspaper for you to see. And I'm thinking, if I can find that, that's great. It was also in the UFO evidence that Dick Hall had done in 1964, and you go through there, you can find the reference, and it references that as well. So I went to the Cedar Rapids Gazette and could not find the story on the day before, but not being dumb, I kept looking beyond that. And the story came out 3 or 4 days after the Arnold sighting. It did not take place in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. It took place in Peoria, Illinois. But the point is, it had evolved to the point where people describing this sighting from Cedar Rapids, Iowa on June 23rd, 1947, involving a formation of saucer-shaped objects. Well, turns out he talked about it happening on the day of the Arnold sighting in the afternoon. It was a guy named Castle, I think. But it was not reported until June 28th, 1947. For my purposes, it was useless because I wanted something prior to Arnold. And this is one of the things I chased, but that kind of got me off on this idea. If I see something, I try to chase it to the original source as best I can. And sometimes you have to go through 3 or 4 places because the one author you're looking at, he's quoted from another book. And you go to that book and he's quoted from another book, and you go to the next book, and then you find out the story has evolved quite a bit from that original source. And so you've got to get as close to the original sources as you possibly can. So we look at all of that sort of thing in an attempt to, they kind of inspired the vetting of people. And the thing with Robert Willingham talking about being a retired Air Force colonel, which boosted his credibility in everybody's mind, but nobody bothered to find out if he'd really been one. And we don't need to go to Willingham. His story was a hoax anyway. But I will say I did find the original story on Willingham. It was in the MUFON Skylook. If you remember the early days of MUFON, their publication was called Skylook. And on the March 1968 issue, I think it's page 3, actually has Willingham's original story. And it does not match anything else that came out. I got to the original source of it. And so that kind of killed that. But I spent a lot of time looking for that. I don't know how I stumbled onto it too. I don't know what I was doing, but I came across it and I couldn't believe it. Here it is. Here's this thing I've been looking for. I wrote to people in Pennsylvania, where the Willingham lived, because it was supposedly in some kind of a weekly newspaper in the Harrisburg area, and they couldn't find it. And I was doing everything I could to find this story because I wanted the original source, and I finally found it.
And you also have done a lot of research and even been a lot of documentaries and shows on television with the MJ-12 documents. And how did you, if I remember correctly, you claimed that they were a hoax, correct?
Originally, it seemed that they were true.
How were you able to look into that information and sift out what was a hoax and what was real or whatever, because a lot of people believe that those are true.
I think the number of people who believe that's true now is dwindling significantly. But there were an awful lot of documents that came out after the original 4 documents, the Eisenhower briefing document, the Truman memo. There was a telex that was involved in it that mentioned it. There were 3 or 4 original documents. Document was the one. And supposedly this was a document created prior to Eisenhower taking over the presidency. It was dated November of 1952, so it was after Eisenhower had run the election. And of course, the president-elect is now brought in onto this stuff. So there's briefings about all of this thing. And this document surfaced anonymously on 35 millimeter film. So you don't have anything that you can look at. You can't test the paper. You can't test the ink. You can just look at it and say, well, is this format right? And that sort of thing. So it comes from an anonymous source. And I think most of these things, when you cannot get to the original source in that sort of circumstance, they're probably fake. I think one of the things I found in the research, but about half of the documents in archives from the Texas Revolution are faked, because there was a big business in, well, if you've got this document from the Texas Revolution, you can sell it to collectors for a lot of money. So there's a lot of that going on. So we were looking at what was said in there. And one of the things that bothered me is, well, the dating format on the Eisenhower briefing document. It was, the dating format was 0. If it was a single digit date, it was like 02. And Well, the dating format was wrong for the military, is what I'm trying to say. I can't remember exactly.
I want to say it was. I could be wrong. It was something like 02 hyphen something.
Well,
It was something like that.
It was like it was 06. Well, I think for the part that I'm thinking of, it was 06 June 1952. But the point was, it was a date that the military didn't use. The format was wrong for the military, and it had the extra zero in there, which became part of the computer world, filling up the spaces. But that was a clue. That was wrong, and I'm thinking, well, that doesn't make sense. And then we got to looking at some of the other things in it. The Willingham story actually shows up in there. But the second thing that I thought of, well, if Roswell was real, which this document indicated it was, Eisenhower already knew about it. He was the chief of staff of the Army in 47. And so as the information went up the chain of command, he would have seen it. In 1947, the Army was split into Army Ground Forces and Army Air Forces. And there was a chief of staff for the Army Ground Forces and the chief of staff for the Army Air Forces. And then there was Eisenhower was the chief of staff of the armies. And so as it goes up the chain of command, it's going to hit his desk, given the nature of what that was, if it was a legitimate happenstance. So it went from the 509th Bomb Group in Roswell to the 8th Air Force headquarters in Fort Worth, the SAC headquarters in Washington, D.C., and then it would have gotten into the chief of staff arena. So Eisenhower knew about it, and there was no reason to create a briefing for him. And then there was the Willingham story in there. And I had learned that the Willingham story was not true. So here's a document of a story that did not appear anywhere until 1968. And all the information was wrong. So how could this story that has surfaced in 1968 with a different set of circumstances appear in the Eisenhower briefing document? And so that led me to the idea it was a hoax. I was bothered by other things in it. And this dating format thing is really annoying me.
Do you think it was deliberately planted into the civilian world by some type of military intelligence? Maybe.
No, I know exactly what happened. Bill Moore, who wrote the Roswell incident back in after Jesse Marcel came out and spilled the beans in 1978, Moore wrote a book with Charles Berlitz called The Roswell Incident, appeared in 1980. Mm-hmm. And then Moore was talking about how he'd run up into a blank wall or a brick wall. He couldn't get any further in the investigation. He was thinking about creating a Roswell type document to show to people, the witnesses, and say, see, the information's out, you can talk to me. That was his story. Stan Friedman told me that. And then, of course, later on, Stan Friedman denied that, but it didn't matter because Brad Sparks knew it too, and Don Schmidt knew it. So I'd gotten the story from like 3 different people that Moore had been wanting to create this document to help him out. He also wrote a book in 1980, I think it was, with Bob Pratt about a OSI guy or maybe a CIA guy who had stumbled onto the big secret of Area 51 type thing. And a lot of the stuff that appeared in this fictional work now suddenly shows up in the documentation about MJ-12. And so we've got that as well. When the MJ-12 papers appeared, well, the book, Pratt and Moore couldn't ever sell the book. So it, became a trunk manuscript. But when the MJ-12 paper surfaced, Pratt got in touch with Moore to say, maybe we ought to dust off our manuscript, thinking, there'll be an interest in this sort of thing. And of course, that never happened. And you wonder why. If you got an opportunity to sell a book, you're going to do it. But there was an awful lot of stuff like that in there. The Willingham story blowing up, the messed up dating formats, misspelled words. You've got a document that's supposedly top secret. But that was the other thing, the Majestic code word. That's another clue. Of course, it was called top secret magic. Magic, of course, had been the code word for the breaking of the Japanese codes during World War II. So I can't believe they would be using a term like that. They'd be confused. We actually found an original, I found an original magic document for if so invaded parts of Europe. And so you've got two documents with the code word matching in them at the same time, which would be really confusing for anybody. So they would have never done it. But then you'd see it as top secret magic or top secret MJ12 or top secret magic 12. And I'm thinking, you don't have 3 separate code words for this thing. If you're going to limit the access to it, you put a code word on it. If you want to limit the access even more, you put a second code word on it, like magic 12. Mm-hmm. And if you want to do it more, you put a third code word on it. So you reduce the number of people who are what they call code word cleared to see the document. You've got to have all 3 clearances to see it. But in the documents being released, they had all these various permutations of MJ12 on it without it being properly set up. So whoever was doing that wasn't aware of how these things worked in the military.
I just don't understand. I don't understand. I've interviewed Stanton Friedman many a times, a few times in person at the Ozark UFO conference there in Eureka Springs. And I don't understand, with, I guess, his pedigree, or I guess you call it that, in the UFO research field, because he was kind of a skeptical person in a way with a lot of certain things, but he was a believer in the documents. I just didn't understand that,
I think what happened is the Roswell investigation kind of petered out at one point in the 1980s because they didn't know where to go. They weren't aware of the yearbook, for example. And sometimes you have to ask the right question to get the information. That somebody doesn't think to tell you something, you have to ask the right question.
Was Stan aware of the yearbook?
Pardon me?
Was Stan aware of the yearbook?
I don't know. I do know that when I got a copy of the yearbook, I went through and numbered the pages. And then George Eberhardt from the Center for UFO Studies made an index. But the problem is the index is only good for my copy, because when Walter Hott made the copy of the yearbook for me, he left out pages that didn't have any names of people on them or pictures of people on them. And there were pages that I didn't number because it was like it said Squadron S on it. So I didn't number that page. So if you're looking at the index, it only works for my copy. And yet somehow I'd shared the copy of the index. No, I guess Eberhard had shared a copy of the index from my work, but Robert Porter had a copy of it. And I said, "Where'd you get the information?" Well, Stan Friedman gave it to me. So Stan Friedman had a copy of my index, but he didn't know that it only worked on my copy of the book. But Stan got off on the MJ12 kick because it looked good in the beginning. I mean, here's actual physical document. We can't trace it back into any government agency, but here's a document.
Do you think ego or pride got in the way because he already wrote so many books about the MJ12?
I think what happened, and I believe the MJ12 documents in the beginning too, until I began to research into it. I think what happened, he became invested in it.
I know he actually has a book. I got it somewhere. MJ.
Yes, Top Secret Magic.
Yeah, Top Secret Magic. Yes, and.
Yeah. But
because he's already wrote books about it, and did he not want to have to say that book is entirely useless because I don't believe in the documents anymore?
Stan could never be wrong. We were arguing once about the plains of San Augustine, and I said, well, you spell it wrong in your book, and he says, well, I saw it on 4 maps, and I said, show me the map, because when you think San Augustine, you think of spelling it like the place in Florida, but it's San and it's AG, not the AUG type thing. And it shows up on all the maps I've ever seen properly spelled, but he couldn't even admit that he had made that simple of a mistake. And I mean, anybody who's written a lot of stuff is going to do that kind You get it in your mind that something is spelled one way, and you just or you misread something and you get it wrong. It's not a conscious error. It's not a lie. It's just a simple, basically a typographical error. But he would not admit even to having misspelled San Augustine. It was somebody else's fault.
So that's a small metaphor of how he probably was with a lot of his other research.
But he had pinned his hopes on the MJ12 documents of moving the case forward, and then Don and I showed up, and we're making progress on the Roswell investigation. I don't know why nobody in the early investigation to talk to the children of Sheriff Wilcox, the Roswell sheriff in 1947, but we did that, and we found other witnesses. We talked to Bill Brazel and got more information than Bill Moore had gotten from him, and places to go and additional information. So I think that the Kufos had communicated with Stan and asked him about what he'd done, but he was busy chasing MJ12. And so Don and I come on, and we're making progress in this. We met him at one point in Illinois. And the only thing I remember is we standing around the parking lot talking about this, but he found out that we had a book contract, or rather I had a book contract for writing a book on Roswell. And he was there saying, well, I proposed that my name would go third on the title and I would get only a quarter of the money. And I'm thinking, why would we do any of that? You've tried to block our investigation. Don was looking for Bill Rickett, and Stan told him, well, Bill Rickett's dead. And Don finally found a phone number for Mary Rickett, well, for Rickett's wife, or for the Ricketts, and he called it, and Mary Rickett answers the phone, and Don's asking her questions, a secondhand source. And she finally says, you want to talk to Bill? He's sitting right here. Stan had told us he was dead. He wasn't dead. He's sitting right there. And so Don developed quite a relationship with the Ricketts, and got information from them that had not come out. And Rickett was able to give us additional information. I talked to Edwin Easley. I think I'm the only person that talked to Edwin Easley. He was a provost marshal, and I know what your provost marshal is. He was a provost marshal at the 509th Bomb Group. Mm-hmm. And he was very reticent what he would say to me about the case. And he said repeatedly, I can't talk about it. I've sworn to secrecy. And at one point he said, I can't talk about it. I promised the president I wouldn't. And the skeptics, of course, all jump on that. Well, do you think the president would talk to a major? And I'm thinking, I remember a case where the president was talking to a lieutenant colonel, and then we bombed Japan. I'm talking about Doolittle, of course, talking to President Roosevelt about his plan to drop bombs on Tokyo not that long after Pearl Harbor. And so, yeah, if the circumstances are right, I believe that the president would talk to a major. But I really think what happened was, and we actually put a Secret Service agent in Roswell at the time, and I'm pretty sure that Easley promised the Secret Service agent, will tell the president I won't talk about it, or I agree not to talk about it. We actually found a letter from the OSI office, I think in Denver, dated December of 1947, in which they thanked Easley for all his help. And we thought, well, that's kind of an interesting letter. But I think Stan got so invested in chasing MJ12 that he lost sight of Roswell, and we brought Roswell into focus. And so then he started looking at stuff about Roswell. In fact, in his book, he uses investigations or notes or transcripts of interviews that Don and I conducted without credit or attribution. One guy wrote to me once and said, did you plagiarize Stan Friedman? Because his stories of his interview with Bill Brazel is exactly the same as yours. And I wrote back and said, no, and I've got the tapes. Stan just used that information with cleverly writing around it, but not giving Don Schmidt nor me the credit for conducting the interview. And that happened a number of times in other things where we got called on stuff. Well, you guys said this and it's not true. And I said, yeah, I got it on tape, pal. And in fact, for the UFO crash at Roswell, I spent nearly 24 hours, not all at once, until one of the lawyers asked me a question. He said, you got this stuff on tape? And I said, yes. And he said, okay, goodbye. because now they understood that we had conducted the research and we could prove it, and that we had not plagiarized anybody's work. Yet Stan had written to suggest we were doing that. Bill Moore did that. Others did that, suggesting we had plagiarized their work or taken their research without credit or attribution. And that's exactly what they did to us. So I'm always very careful to cite my sources, that because I know what it's like to have that happen to you.
So Kevin,
So
go ahead, Kevin.
I was going to say, well, so Stan, I think Stan just thought that the investigation was going, the MJ12 investigation was going the direction to go, and he got caught up in it, and it was a dead end. And I know that Stan and I traded letters about the viability of the MJ12 documents at times. And so, I did a book called Case MJ12, which was updated. The laugh. I did the book. It was published like in 1999. And in 2014, somebody wrote a review of the book on Amazon. It says, "Well, there's no new information in this book." And I'm thinking, it was when it was published, pal. Look at the look at the copyright date. But I updated it a couple of years ago, so it's Case MJ12 updated, and the new information and some of the other things we'd learned are in that book.
So I want to ask you something that you've been asked hundreds or maybe even thousands of times. But there's always newcomers to the scene. There's always younger generations, coming in. When I got interested in this, probably 06, when I started doing my research, I was 20 years old. And there's probably a lot of 18 to 20-year-olds now that, they may not be familiar with you and other researchers, but
What, they don't know me?
Or maybe, with that, what you've been asked probably thousands of times is what's your conclusion on Roswell? What was the craft? What were the bodies? Walk us down that path a little bit, especially, for the newcomers that are somewhat new to the field.
Bill Brazel took Don and me out to the debris field. This is the area that Mac Brazel found in July of 1947. Field pasture covered with all this metallic debris. Didn't know who was going to clean the mess up. And it was a real problem for him because it was right near a watering station for the livestock on the ranch he worked. So it caused him a lot of trouble having to drive the livestock around this pasture that was filled with debris. So he went into the sheriff's office in Roswell, New Mexico, talked to George Wilcox, took some debris with him, and that's kind of critical. And Wilcox couldn't identify it. So they called out to the base, and Jesse Marcel responded, and he looked at it. He couldn't identify it. He went back to the base, talked to the commanding officer, Colonel Blanchard, who said, "Well, we got this new counterintelligence guy, take him out there with you." So they went out to the debris field and were there. They got there late in the day, so late in the day they couldn't do anything. They were there overnight. Next morning they went out and picked up debris. Marcel then, on his way home, stops at his house in Roswell and shows his wife and his son some of this debris, and then goes on out to the base. The next morning, they at the base, they're looking at the stuff. Blanchard orders Walter Haut to put out a press release. They had a flying saucer. And that was, where the world learned about this. Marcel's on his way to Fort Worth with more of the debris. So that covers the debris field. We've got descriptions from Marcel. We've got descriptions from Bill Brazel. We've got descriptions and we've got descriptions of the metallic debris found there. Bill Brazel told us, we were on the debris field, and we were up at one end of it. And he said it was narrow at the top, and it widened out and then narrowed again. He says, like the thing had come down and skipped. And we later found what we call the impact site, where there was the craft and the bodies, much closer to Roswell, which kind of was kind of confusing in the beginning because we thought it was all located up around Corona, New Mexico, and part of it's much, much closer to Roswell. In fact, Bill Rickett, when he was talking to Don Schmidt, I think he said the same things to Mark Rodiker from the Center for UFO Studies and in other interviews, said that he went out to the site and it was only like 40 minutes to get there. It wasn't a 3.5, 4 hour drive to get up to Corona, New Mexico. It was not that far from Roswell and not that far from one of the main highways. So that became an area of confusion until we were able to sort out that there were two distinct sites. We have descriptions of the craft and the bodies from a number of people who were involved in the retrieval or moving the bodies from the crash site to right field. One of the things that came out was the Roswell Fire Department being involved in this in some fashion. Frankie Rowe, her father was a lieutenant in the fire department in July of 1947. So she was telling us what her father had told her. He had gone out to the site and seen the craft, said there were, I think he said there were two or three, and there was one alive, I think he said, if I remember correctly. Skeptics came after us on that, saying, well, there's no record in the Roswell Fire Department of them going out on this run out there. And a councilman who was on the city council in the 1950s said, well, the fire department wouldn't make runs outside the city limits. I went to the fire department. They had records going back to 1947, and I made copies of the relevant pages that they did, in fact, make runs outside the city limits, but there was nothing on this specific case, which was kind of disturbing. But I kind of wrecked part of their description where they said, well, the fire department wouldn't go. Carl Flock found a guy who'd worked there, J.C. Smith, interviewed him, and this stuff is in Carl's book. And Smith said, no, we didn't go out there. We didn't do that. I talked to Smith, and I asked one additional question. J.C. Smith was telling me the same thing he told Carl. I said, well, did you know Dan Dwyer? He said, oh, yeah, I know Dan. He went out there. And I said, what? And it turned out Dwyer went out in his own car. It wasn't a run from the fire department. It wasn't an official run. He just went out to see what was going on. Smith told me that a colonel had come in to the fire. It's always a colonel. It's never a captain, never a lieutenant. It's always a colonel. There weren't that many colonels in Roswell that come into the fire department. But he said an officer had come into the fire department and told them they didn't need to go out there because they had the base fire department had taken care of the problem. Sheriff Wilcox sent two of his deputies out on the day that Marcel came into the office. He sent two of his deputies out. They came back hours later and they hadn't found anything except the big burned area, circular burned area. And then apparently Wilcox went out there and he got close enough that he saw the craft and the bodies as well, because he talked to his wife about that a little bit. But the real point is, so we have two distinct sites. They were not located close together. They were located at different times. Mac Brazel turned the military onto one. I don't know how they found the other one, although I was told by some that Mac Brazel was taken in a private plane and they were surveying the area and they spotted it that way. Because Mac Brazel later told Frank Joyce about the bodies not being green. I think Don Schmidt and Tom Carey have a bit of a transcript with that interview with Joyce in their book. I think it's actually in my book too, Roswell in the 21st Century, but you can read said. But anyhow, they found that, they cordoned off the area, they recovered everything. Debris was sent on July 8th from Roswell to Fort Worth. Frank Joyce and George Walsh, reporters for the two radio stations in Roswell, put Walter Haut's press release about having found the flying saucer on the news wires. I think Walsh actually won the race, got it out first because had to go through Albuquerque, and Walsh could do it right there in Roswell. But there's a timeline that came out from the Daily Illini, which told the times of everything. So from the point that the press release went out until the cover-up began was like 3.5 hours. And then there's pictures of Marcel, pictures of Ramey and Dubose, who was the chief of staff, and then a picture of Irving Newton, who was a weather officer, that were taken in that time frame. So we got all 7 of those pictures found as well. So we know what was in Ramey's office. It was in fact a weather balloon. It was in fact a Ray-Win target. But Marcel, when he was shown the picture, says, that's not the stuff I brought from Roswell. And Johnny Mann, who was a reporter for WWL-TV, was talking about that as well. When he showed picture, excuse me, I have to get a bit of a drink here.
Okay, that's fine.
Yes, this is really water. It's not vodka. Anyhow, Johnny Mann was a reporter for WWL-TV, and I think it's in New Orleans, and took Marcel out to the desert. Marcel couldn't find the site. It's desert. It looked pretty much the same all over. But man showed him the pictures in the Roswell incident. Said, well, here, he says, Jess, I got to tell you, that looks like a weather balloon. And Jess and Marcel said, that's not the stuff I brought to Fort Worth. And we got that from 2 or 3 other people as well. So it was clear that the stuff was switched. Dubose told us the stuff was switched too. He was the, like I said, chief of staff. He was a full colonel at the time, retired as a brigadier general. So what we know for certain is something fell at Roswell. Everybody agrees. Everybody talks pretty much about the debris field, but not so much about the impact site. Bill Brazel described some of the debris. Jesse Marcel described some of the debris. And if you take their words as gospel, then it's nothing that was built on this planet. Bill Brazel told us, and I was discussing this with somebody just the other day, was had a piece of debris, said it was light as balsa wood. And somebody said, well, how could they make a spacecraft out of balsa wood? And I said, no, you misunderstand. He said it was light as balsa wood. He didn't say it was balsa wood. And he said it was very tough. He said he got out his pocket knife and he tried to get a scraping on it because he wanted to see if there's a stratification there. And he said he couldn't even get a scraping. It was that tough. And he said that he'd used his pocket knife to cut barbed wire. So it was not balsa wood because, I mean, if you get a balsa wood 2x4, you can crush it in your hand. You can look like Superman crushing this 2x4. So there's a lot of that going on. The problem we have now, if you can go to various websites. There's all kinds of information out there. Some of it's made up, some of it's misconstrued, some of it is accurate. And you just have to look through that and see if you can figure it out. I think David Rudiak has a site. Now he's a very, very pro Roswell UFO crash. He's got a website, so his bias clearly shows through on that stuff. But he also, Frank Kaufman, who we talked about, who was one of the guys everything, we found out that he was lying about it. David's got Kaufman's some of Kaufman's information on his website, but he says that it's very problematic about after we learned that about him. So you've got to kind of sort through all of that stuff, but that's kind of the story. And then once you get to Fort Worth with the weather balloon or Jesse Marcel, the story dies because it's a weather balloon. The news media don't care about that. And they can't find Marcel because he's in Fort Worth. So there, they can't get a hold of Mac Brazel because he has no telephone and is not sure where the ranch house is. And it's very hard to find in today's world, it's very hard to find if you don't know where to look. They called Sheriff Wilcox and he said, well, I can't tell you much. I'm working with the boys out at the base. So the story kind of died there. Periodically, it would show up. Frank Edwards, in his book, Flying Saucers, Serious Business, has a short couple of paragraphs about the Roswell case. And about the only thing he got right was it was Roswell, New Mexico, and it was July. It was pretty much wrong, but
what about the alien bodies?
Well, Frank Edwards doesn't mention those. Stories of the bodies came from a number of people. Some of those we've been able to discredit. Walter Hott, before he passed, and he was the information officer at the base, and for literally decades. And the first affidavit he signed, he said all release. And then he'd qualify that and say, well, I'm not sure I wrote the press release.
Repeat that, Kevin. You glitched out just like a couple seconds.
Well, Walter Hott wrote the press release, or for decades, that's what he said. I just wrote the press release. I don't know anything more. And then he would kind of qualify that. Well, I might not have written the press release. Colonel Blanchard may have dictated it to me over the phone, or he may have given me the basic points, and I wrote the press release, or the NCO in my office wrote the press. Anyhow, Walter Hott took the press release, media outlets in Roswell at the time. But there was a point there that I have now completely and totally lost. But there's like two versions of the press release, and I think that what that tells me. Oh, I know what it was. I'm sorry, you asked about bodies. That's where we were going. Okay, so Walter Hott did the first press release. In his first affidavit, just said I only wrote the press release. I didn't know anything more. Then around 2000, he may have seen a great deal more, and finally he produced a second affidavit. Actually, Don Schmidt wrote it. I have no problem with Don writing it, because he worked for the information that Walter Hott gave him, and Walter there, so she was able to verify it, and the affidavit was properly notarized. And I say that because some of the affidavits that were taken were not properly notarized, and talked about having seen one of the bodies and seen the craft itself. Now, the only thing I did was the press release, and then now 20 years, 30 years later, he's saying, well, I saw bodies too. You say, well, I don't know. I talked to a guy named Richard Harris, who was a assistant finance officer in Roswell in 1947. And I talked to him in the mid 1990s. And Harris was telling me, he said, yeah, I was in the hangar with Walter Hott, and Walter says, you want to see the bodies there in the next. And Harris said, well, he reached out to open the door, and then he said, I don't want to see him. So he didn't go in to see him. But the point is, here is Harris telling me that Walter Hott knew about the bodies and had seen the bodies before Walter Hott admitted it to anybody. And I'd asked them that question a half a dozen times, if not more, about the bodies. And I never saw them. I just wrote the press release. So Walter Hott, depending on your level of your threshold for evidence, is Walter Hott embellishing his story now? Why would he do that in 2000 when he had not done it before? And others had embellished their stories. Frankie Rowe talked about the bodies, but that was secondhand. Barbara Duggar, the granddaughter of the sheriff, talked about bodies that she learned about from her mother, who learned about it from her husband, who was the sheriff. In 1947, I guess if you elected the sheriff in Roswell, you also elected the wife and the children, because they lived above the jail, and the wife became like the matron for the jail. So when Mac Brazel brought in the debris, some of the debris, when he first time he went into the sheriff's office, one of the daughters, Phyllis McGuire, was there. So she heard part of the story. Well, and so they got that story. And Barbara Duggar talks about how her grandmother, Inez Wilcox, talked about the bodies, and then told her that the military had told George to talk about it under great penalties like that. But of course, Barbara Duggar's story is third hand. Inez Wilcox wrote a story, an article that I think she thought she'd place in the Reader's Digest, if you're familiar with that book.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, she called it 4 years in the county jail. And the gag was she was the matron and not the prisoner. And in that article, there's a paragraph about the crash and the bodies. The problem I have with that is there's no date on the article she wrote, and the part about the crash and the bodies was written later. And I think it's insert A on one of the pages, but it's not dated. And I worked very hard to learn when Inez Wilcox passed away, because if he passed away before 1980 and the book The Roswell Incident came out, well, that would be one thing. And if you died after that, well, that could be a source of contamination. Or it could have been, since they were talking about that, she now felt safe of putting that magazine. But she died after the book came out. So, but there's a bit of a document that talks about bodies. You can argue that it's irrelevant because it was contaminated by other people talking about this story, or you could realize that now that the story was out, she felt safe in adding that to of that. I've got, like I said, I've got a copy of the entire article and the insert, and I think there's a lot of people who have that as well. I've published that in a couple of the books that I've written on the Roswell case. So there are some good stories, some credible people talking about it that we were able to talk to in firsthand. There are other stories that came out sort of secondhand, and there's some limited documentation about that. And you have to ask yourself, how credible is that documentation? I talked to a woman named Anna Wilmon in the mid-90s. I got her on videotape because we learned the value of videotape over. But she talked about how she and her husband were returning from somewhere in New Mexico and came across the crash site and saw the crash craft and the bodies, and she's described the bodies. Two of them being outside the craft, as a matter of fact. One looking like, I think it was she that said one looked like it had gotten out of the craft and sitting under a tree, like trying to catch the shade. I'm not sure how credible her story is. I asked her about whether you have any documentation, diaries, letters, anything like that. She said no, she had nothing like that. But when I first heard the tale, we believed the impact site was much closer to Corona. Than we found out later that it was much closer to Roswell. So that was kind of an interesting point on that. So we do have some stories of bodies and things like that. And for yourself, is this story credible? Is this contaminated story? Is this complete confabulation?
So we have about 10, 15 minutes left, but I want to get your take with the last little time that we have with David Grush. You know, he came forward last year. I want to get your, see me. I don't, it's not that because, you know, I was a part of the government, you're a part of the government, you know, there are credible people within, you know, the military, the other government agencies and things like that. But why now? Why come forward now? You know, past couple of years with all these congressional hearings, and what are they? What's going on in your mind, Kevin? Because it's not that I'm always skeptical because we know that there's been a lot of deceit within ufology, within the UFO field, the research field, for a long time. Um, a lot of false information, a lot of implanted false information. And is it no different now? You know, if you analyze the past, the same thing may be happening now in these congressional hearings in DC when it comes to disclosure. What's your thoughts on the
Well,
state of
my problem with the Grush testimony is we, meaning people like you and I outside the government, don't know what cases he's talking about. We don't know who the witnesses are. We can't do anything to vet the information. The only thing we know is he talked about an Italian crash in 1933, which is
33?
a hoax. Which is a hoax.
Was that in the Black Forest? What he said, or something like that?
No, he just talked about this Italian crash in 1933.
Italian, yes.
And colleagues in Italy, when that first story came out in the 1990s, J12, by the way, they tried to verify the story as they had gotten it at the time. And there were two camps, the guys who truly believe it and are probably adding to the information by making it up, and guys who were investigating it. They couldn't find some of the sources they talked about in this craft. They couldn't find the libraries that the information was in. And I'm not sure how a craft that crashed in Italy in 1933 ended up in the United States after World War II. I would have think that the Nazis would have got it and used that to try to reverse engineer it, but that's just me. But that case is clearly a hoax. And I talk about that on my blog. I mean, there's a long discussion of this and provides you with the sources of where this information came from and what was done in the way of investigation. So it's a hoax. And the other thing he mentioned was Roswell. Well, I don't think there's anybody in the United States, unless they just crossed the border, who doesn't know about Roswell. I was talking early 1990s, we were talking about this. And he said, you know, if you went out on the street, you know, maybe 1 out of 10 people, maybe 1 out of 50 people would know what Roswell meant. And in today's environment, there was a question on Jeopardy that talked about the Roswell UFO crash. It shows how pervasive it's become. There was a TV show about Roswell with the teenagers in Roswell High School. I never watched it, by the way. And there was the movie Roswell that starred Kyle MacLachlan. So, I mean, how many documentaries have there been on Roswell? There's been just literally dozens of those. And I've been involved in many of them myself.
Yeah, a bunch of them.
Myself. And there's more coming out.
Do you think he's a mold to
No, I don't think
plant
so.
plant misinformation or not?
So I don't think so. What we need to actually make an intelligent evaluation of what he says are names, dates, and locations. I did on my blog not that long ago a speculative piece on these might be the cases that he's referring to. It would be things like Kingman, Arizona, which keeps popping up, which is a hoax. Kecksburg, Shag Harbor. So these are the cases I think that if you were not fully cognizant of the history of UFO crashes. In fact, I did an interview with Ryan Wood because his book just came out again. He updated his book on UFO crashes. And I said to him when I started the interview, I said, I think I am probably the leading expert on UFO crashes in the United States now that Len Stringfield has passed. I said, but you're probably the leading expert on worldwide crashes. So we both got a title that way. But the point is there's UFO crashes that are kind of in the public consciousness. They may not realize what we're talking about, but that are there. And if we knew what Grush specifically was talking about, we would be able to evaluate his claims, but we can't evaluate what he says. And he may be talking about cases that we know is a hoax that we've been very, very involved in this investigation for 20, 30 years. He talked about overhearing stuff or people telling him stuff, and we don't know how much those people knew and what they're talking about. He talked about the way he was talking and stuff. He had an opportunity to come in contact with some of the people who have been exploiting this sort of thing for years, but we don't know specifically what cases he's talking about. If he's talking about some of the cases I've listed in my piece on my blog, which by the way is kevinrandle.blogspot.com. I don't know why I haven't said that before, for crying out loud.
It'll be in the description and it'll also be on the video also.
But anyway, if you look at that, you can see, well, here's the cases that have gotten some kind of we could say notoriety, some information published about them over the years in the United States, and those so people would be cognizant of those. People have heard stories about some of these things and don't know have not taken enough time or haven't had enough time to look deeply into it. But if he talks about like the Willingham story of El Indio Guerrero, which is sort of the Del Rio, Texas case, if he's talking about that, we know that's a hoax. And that suggests that his information isn't all that accurate. Is he lying about it? No, I think he's just heard people talking about this stuff and thought it should come out. But he has not done the kind of research that several of us have done into these specific crashes. If you want to know what happened at Kecksburg, the person talked to Stan Gordon. Mm-hmm. Stan Gordon and I disagree, but that's the person to talk to. You want to talk about the crash in Kingman, I'm the person to talk to because I've done the deep dive in that, and I know where all the pieces are. I know where all the bodies are buried, so to speak, in that case. By the way, it's a hoax. But Shag Harbor, Don Ledger and Chris Stiles are the guys to talk to about that. That's, by the way, in Canada. So it just really depends on what information he has, who he's been talking to, and what is the value of what they have said. So I don't really know how to evaluate Grush at the moment, but I'd like to know who we would talk to. By the way, he was only a major. I retired as lieutenant colonel.
And then with him coming forward, he's in the news. Yep. He's a big talking point within, the UFO field. And then you always have these researchers, a certain few, and if you've been following the Grush story, you know who they are. They usually always leech on, just like leeches, to whatever the most popular talking point or the whatever's going on, in the field. And it's like they try to take control of the situation and then try to make films and documentaries and all that stuff. And it's almost like it's just a big money hustle, to try to claim Grush has hit their source and they're going to take control of his whatever he's talking about and put it in films, books, and all that. I don't know. I think that's a big problem with the research is that a lot of people just try to control certain. I don't know if they're trying to control the narratives per se, but more trying to, let's say, claim Grush is theirs, and they talk to Grush, and try to more of a way to push their career forward,
yes,
to keep their state in the their current affair in the research or whatever, um, alive. Keep, because if they have Grush behind the scenes who they're talking to and like that, they get to go on the bigger shows that get more movie deals or whatever it is, and I think that's a big problem in the field of the UFO research.
Well, there's always that sort of thing going on, and the problem, as I've said before, is a lot of these people don't bother with researching it. They're just interested in the story. We have the Leslie Kean, Ralph
Mm-hmm.
Blumenthal story that started this whole mess back in 2017. And Grush comes forward later, and there's talk about this, and the government saying, "Well, we've got to know about these UAP. We've got to do this. We've got to do the other thing." And Grush comes out with a story about having 12 recovered craft. Well, that kind of escalates the story to the point and makes it more real because we've got craft, but we don't know what stories he's talking about. The two we know for sure are Roswell and this Italian thing, and the Italian thing is a hoax. Now, I guess the idea is Frank Hoffman told Don and me stuff that we reported as accurate. We weren't lying. We weren't making it up. We believed the source was being honest with us. We made the mistake of believing Hoffman, but we weren't making the stuff up. If Grush has heard what others have told him or others have said, he's overheard what they've said, and he's telling us exactly what he heard, and he believes it to be the truth, then he's not lying. He's telling the truth as he knows it.
It doesn't make his source technically true though.
No, it does. I was going to say, he believes the stories are true. He's reporting what he says. He's being honest in his reporting of those stories, but that doesn't mean what he was told or what he overheard is accurate in any way. And a lot of this stuff has been around for a long time. Take Aztec. How long have we heard about Aztec, New Mexico, and the crash there? Almost from 1948, when Silas Newton and is it not Ralph Jabauer? The other guy working with Newton, Silas Newton, started talking about it. And then you had the article that came out in 1952 from J.P. Kahn that said this is all a hoax. And yet people are still saying, yeah, but it's really true. It's, that was kind of a cover up and all of that going on. So you have to look at all of that stuff. And we don't have enough information to make an intelligent evaluation of what he's saying, other than say, we don't have enough information. But a lot of people say, well, he's talking about UFO crashes and he's a retired intelligence officer. Hello, so am I. But the point is that doesn't make it true either. And they're getting what they want to hear. They're learning what they want to hear. So they embrace it. They don't want to do anything to destroy that belief structure.
And if you study this over the years, it seemed like it's like another modern day approach to the MJ12 documents. Everybody's leeching on to it. It doesn't make it technically true, but one final question. Do you think we'll ever get to the bottom of Roswell? What I mean, I'm not, when it comes to like a disclosure type thing, with the government admitting what actually, but then again, how what they're saying is true or misinformation. Do you ever think we'll actually get 100% credible truth? You know what I mean? Get to the bottom of it.
The only way, and it wouldn't work. I was going to say the only way it'll ever happen is if the aliens land, and say, "Here we are," but then there will government stage that to put us in our place.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's going to have to be triggered off world. I don't think that there's no motivation for the government to ever come out and tell us the truth. It's clear they're not telling us the truth. There may be another truth, a terrestrially based truth that we don't know. And for some reason, they're keeping that hidden. I would think in the 1990s, when the Air Force did the investigation of Roswell, if there was some kind of hidden truth, it would have been at that point, it would have come out. And we would say, well, that was like 70 years ago, so who cares? But I don't think we're moving closer to disclosure. I thought at one time we were after the Keene article came out and some of that discussion, but what I see is just really kind of where we were back in 1947 and 1952, the government telling, oh, there's nothing to it, don't worry about it. We've investigated this carefully, and there's nothing to it. And I go through the blue book files, and I say, well, would you like to see how carefully they investigated this phenomena, come up with explanations that make no sense whatsoever, but they're satisfied. So I don't think we're moving closer to disclosure. I think our science is going to get to the point where we will be able to determine that there's life on other planets and that it's gotten here. But we're not at that point yet. But it's going to be something like that that triggers. It's not going to be the government coming out unless the aliens land, and then it's a whole different argument.
Well, Kevin, thank you very much for coming on the show. I look forward to speaking with you down the road at some point. Got a lot of notes you didn't cover, but man, thank you very much for coming on Beyond Forbidden. Appreciate it.
Oh, glad to do it. Give me a call when you need a guest again.